Hello everyone, and welcome. I'm excited to kick off today's presentation on research types. Today, we'll explore different kinds of research methods and how they apply across various fields. We'll cover the main categories, their purposes, and how to choose the right type for your project. Let's get started and dive into the fascinating world of research. Let's dive into our learning objectives for today. First, we'll explore the differences between primary and secondary research. Primary research involves collecting new data directly from sources, like surveys or experiments, while secondary research uses existing data, such as reports or academic articles. Understanding this helps us choose the right approach for our questions. Next, we'll look at basic, applied, and translational research. Basic research is about expanding knowledge without immediate practical application. Applied research focuses on solving specific real-world problems. Translational research bridges the gap, turning basic discoveries into practical solutions that can be implemented. Recognizing these types helps us see the purpose behind different studies. Finally, we'll define qualitative, quantitative, and mixed research methods. Qualitative research explores ideas and experiences in depth, often through interviews or observations. Quantitative research deals with numbers, measurements, and statistical analysis. Mixed research combines both approaches to give a more comprehensive understanding. Connecting all these concepts, understanding the different types of research equips us to design and interpret studies effectively, aligning with our overall goal of becoming more skilled and informed researchers. Let's talk about primary research, also known as original or first-hand research. Essentially, this means the researcher is collecting new, original data that is specific to their particular project. According to Grattan and Jones, 2010, this is what makes primary research unique. When you're doing primary research, you're gathering information directly, firsthand, rather than relying on existing data from databases or published sources. The main goal here is to produce new knowledge. This is why primary research is often called original research. It aims to answer questions that haven't been asked before or haven't been answered yet. Because of this high level of originality, primary research stands out from secondary research, which depends on existing data. And this aspect of originality is actually a key factor when it comes to publishing research. Journals and other outlets look for work that offers new insights, as noted by Callahan in 2002. So, in the context of our overall presentation, understanding primary research helps us appreciate the effort and importance of generating new knowledge, which is often the core aim of scholarly work. Now, let's take a look at some of the main types of research methods we use in medical science. First, we have clinical trials, also known as interventional studies. These involve testing the efficacy and safety of a new drug, device, or procedure directly on human participants. A common example is randomized controlled trials, or RCTs, which are considered the gold standard for determining if a treatment really works and is safe. Next, we have cohort studies, which are observational in nature. In these studies, researchers follow a group of people over time to see who develops a specific disease and to identify potential risk factors. This approach helps us understand how diseases develop and what might contribute to their onset. Then there are case control studies, another type of observational research. Here, we compare people who already have a disease, called cases, with those who do not, called controls. The goal is to look back and see if there are any differences in past exposures or behaviors that could have contributed to the disease. Moving on, laboratory or basic research involves experiments conducted in controlled environments, like labs. These studies help us understand the fundamental mechanisms of diseases or treatments at a cellular or molecular level, providing insights that can lead to new therapies. Finally, I want to emphasize that all these methods involve the original collection of new data, specifically aimed at answering a current research question. In many cases, the researcher is directly involved in designing the study, executing it, and gathering the data, which ensures that the research is tailored to the specific problem at hand. Together, these methods form the backbone of medical research, helping us to improve diagnosis, treatment, and prevention strategies. Secondary research, in essence, is about taking existing information and making sense of it to draw bigger picture conclusions. It involves analyzing, synthesizing, and interpreting data that was already collected and published by others. Think of it as building on the work that's already out there. The key characteristic here is that it leverages pre-existing data, which allows us to consolidate a lot of information into a summary, critique, or even a new perspective. This approach is especially valuable because it saves time and resources, and it helps us see patterns or insights that might not be obvious from individual studies. Connecting this to our overall theme, secondary research is a powerful way to broaden our understanding by integrating multiple sources, giving us a more comprehensive view without starting from scratch. Now, let's take a closer look at some common methods in medical science. First up, systematic reviews. Think of these as comprehensive and structured reviews of all the relevant primary research on a specific clinical question. They use predefined methods to minimize bias, ensuring that the findings are as reliable as possible. This approach helps us synthesize the evidence in a thorough way. Next, we have meta-analyses. These are often part of a systematic review, and they involve a statistical technique that combines the results from multiple studies. By doing this, we can get a more precise overall estimate of an effect, which is especially useful when individual studies have small sample sizes or conflicting results. Then there are literature reviews. These provide a broad overview and summary of existing knowledge, including findings and theoretical or methodological contributions on a particular topic. They're valuable for getting a general sense of what's known and what gaps might still exist. Finally, secondary data analysis involves analyzing data sets that were originally collected for another purpose. For example, using hospital administrative records or National Health Survey data to answer a new research question. This approach allows us to make the most of existing data and can be very cost-effective. Overall, these methods form the backbone of medical research, each playing a crucial role in advancing our understanding and improving clinical practice. In this slide, we're looking at the key differences between primary and secondary research. First, let's talk about data sources. Primary research involves collecting new, original data directly from the source, so it's first-hand information. Secondary research, on the other hand, relies on existing data that has already been collected by others. Next, regarding data collection, when you're doing primary research, it's your team or you who gather the data, whether through surveys, experiments, or observations. With secondary research, you're analyzing data that has already been gathered by someone else, like in literature reviews or meta-analyses. When it comes to purpose, primary research aims to answer specific, often new questions. It's tailored to your particular needs. Secondary research's goal is more about summarizing or reevaluating the existing evidence, bringing together what's already known to see the bigger picture. For examples, primary research includes clinical trials, cohort studies, and lab experiments, things where you're generating new data. Secondary research examples are systematic reviews, meta-analyses, and comprehensive literature reviews, where you're synthesizing existing studies. Understanding these differences helps us choose the right approach depending on our research questions and goals. Let's start by looking at the first question on this slide. It asks, which of the options listed is an example of primary data? Now, primary data is data that you collect yourself, specifically for your current research or project. For example, if you conduct a new customer survey, you are gathering fresh, original data tailored to your needs. In contrast, the other options like published census reports, academic journal articles, and corporate databases are considered secondary data. These are data sources that have already been collected by others and are available for analysis. Moving on to the second part of the slide, it discusses secondary data and how it is generally characterized. Most of us might think that collecting data ourselves is easier or cheaper, but actually, secondary data is typically faster and more cost-effective because it's already available. However, it's important to remember that secondary data might not always be perfectly suited to your specific research needs. It's not always unique or specific to the current situation, since it was collected for a different purpose. Overall, understanding the difference between primary and secondary data helps us choose the right sources for our research, balancing cost, time, and relevance. All right, let's talk about basic research. Essentially, it's all about understanding the fundamental principles and processes of nature. What's important to note is that it often doesn't have a specific practical goal in mind. Instead, it focuses on answering the big why and how questions, like why does this happen or how does this work? Think of basic research as the foundation of scientific knowledge. It's the starting point for many discoveries, driven mainly by curiosity and a desire to expand what we know about the world around us. So, in the context of our overall theme, basic research is crucial because it builds the knowledge base that later enables more applied or practical innovations. It's about exploring the unknown for the pure joy of understanding, and that curiosity fuels progress in every field. Today, I want to talk about the goal of fundamental research. Essentially, it's about gaining a deeper, more complete understanding of the basic aspects of phenomena and observable facts. Importantly, this kind of research isn't driven by immediate practical applications or products in mind. Instead, it's focused on uncovering the underlying principles that govern how things work. The focus here is on understanding processes at the most fundamental level. Whether it's molecules, cells, or entire organisms, the aim is to see how these components operate and interact in their simplest forms. Most of this research takes place in university and institutional laboratories, where scientists can carefully investigate these fundamental questions. A key question we often ask in this context is, how does this molecule, cell, or organism work? For example, a geneticist might study the precise molecular mechanism behind how a particular protein folds, or how a virus replicates. And here's the interesting part. Their goal isn't necessarily to develop a new treatment or product right away. Instead, they're seeking to understand the fundamental laws of biology that govern these processes. This kind of knowledge can eventually lead to breakthroughs, but at this stage, the emphasis is purely on understanding the basic science. Let's talk about applied research. Essentially, this is about taking existing scientific knowledge and methods and using them to tackle real-world problems. It's not about exploring theories for their own sake, but focusing on practical, immediate needs. The main goal here is to find solutions to specific issues that can have a direct impact. So, when we think about applied research, we're looking at how science can be a tool to solve problems that matter in everyday life or in various industries. This approach ties into our overall theme of how research can be both innovative and practically useful. The goal here is to gain the knowledge or understanding necessary to figure out how we can meet a specific recognized need. And it's important to remember, this approach is solution-driven, meaning we're focused on finding practical answers. Our focus is on leveraging existing scientific principles and knowledge to solve real-world problems. Instead of starting from scratch, we look at what we already know and see how it can be applied effectively. This kind of work can happen in various settings, labs, clinics, or even industrial environments, where scientific research and practical application come together. A key question we always ask is, can we use what we already know to solve this particular health problem? It's about translating existing knowledge into tangible solutions. For example, imagine a pharmaceutical company screening thousands of chemical compounds that are already known against a protein that causes a disease. This protein's mechanism was uncovered through basic research. The goal is to identify potential drugs that can block its function, ultimately leading to new treatments. So, in essence, this slide highlights how we use scientific understanding and existing resources to develop solutions that address real-world health challenges efficiently and effectively. Our goal here is to translate the findings from basic science into tangible interventions that can actually make a difference in human health. When we talk about this, the key phrase to remember is bench to bedside and back again. This highlights a really important concept. It's a two-way street. Not only do discoveries in the lab lead to new diagnostics, treatments, and procedures, but clinical observations can also inform and drive new basic research questions. This bidirectional process is crucial because it helps us overcome the barriers that often exist between discovery and clinical utility. Now, let's clarify what translational research really is. It's the bridge that connects basic science discoveries directly to their practical use in patients and populations. Think of it as a subset of applied research, meaning it takes what we learn in the lab and applies it in real-world settings to improve health outcomes. By focusing on this translational process, we're making sure that scientific advances don't stay confined to the laboratory, but instead become real, impactful solutions for patients. Now, let's take a closer look at how translational research is typically structured into phases. As you can see in the table, the first phase, T1, is often called bench to bedside. This phase involves taking a basic scientific discovery and transforming it into a candidate health application that can be tested in humans. For example, developing a prototype drug, device, or diagnostic test falls under this phase. An example of this would be testing the safety and determining the optimal dosage of a new compound in a small group of human volunteers, which is usually part of phase I clinical trials. Moving on to the second phase, T2, known as bedside to practice. Here, the focus shifts to evaluating how effective and cost-effective the intervention is. The goal is to generate solid evidence that can lead to clinical guidelines. For instance, conducting a large-scale randomized controlled trial, or RCT, to prove that a new drug is better than the standard treatment is a typical example of this phase, often happening during phase III clinical trials. Connecting this back to our overall theme, these phases are essential for translating scientific discoveries into real-world health solutions. They ensure that promising innovations are thoroughly tested and proven before becoming standard practice. Now, let's take a closer look at the final phases in this process. In phase 3, which we call practice to community, the focus shifts toward how we can best implement proven guidelines and interventions into everyday clinical practice and health systems. For example, we might study the most effective ways to disseminate new cancer screening guidelines to primary care doctors, with the goal of increasing patient participation and early detection. Moving on to phase 4, community to public health, we evaluate the real-world impact of these interventions on the broader population. This involves analyzing long-term outcomes, such as how a new vaccine program affects national disease incidence and mortality rates over time. These phases highlight the importance of not just developing interventions, but ensuring they are effectively adopted, integrated, and ultimately have a meaningful impact on population health. They connect back to our overall theme of translating research into real-world health improvements. Let's take a closer look at the summarized differences among these three types of research. First, the primary goal varies significantly. Basic research is all about gaining knowledge for its own sake, driven by curiosity and a desire to understand fundamental principles. Applied research, on the other hand, focuses on solving a specific problem. It's more goal-oriented and aimed at practical solutions. Translational research acts as a bridge, connecting the fundamental knowledge gained from basic research to tangible patient benefits, essentially translating discoveries into real-world applications. When we consider focus, basic research emphasizes fundamental understanding, getting to the core of how things work. Applied research zeroes in on practical applications, how we can use that knowledge to address real issues. Translational research sits in the middle, focusing on implementing those findings in ways that impact public health and patient care. Looking at the timeline, basic research is often long-term and unpredictable, as discoveries can take years to develop. Applied research tends to be medium-term and goal-oriented, moving steadily toward specific outcomes. Translational research spans medium to long-term stages, often involving phased steps to ensure effective implementation and impact. Finally, where these types of research happen also differs. Basic research usually happens at the bench or in the lab, where fundamental experiments are conducted. Applied research might take place in labs, clinics, or industry settings, anywhere practical solutions are developed. Translational research operates at the clinical community interface, where discoveries are tested and adapted for real-world use, ultimately aiming to improve patient care and public health outcomes. All right, let's take a closer look at how different types of research align with their primary purposes. On this slide, we have three main types: basic research, applied research, and translational research. First, basic research, labeled as B, is all about understanding the fundamental laws of physics, which is represented here as II. This kind of research is driven by curiosity and a desire to expand our fundamental knowledge without immediate practical applications. Next, applied research, marked as A, aims to solve specific problems or develop new solutions. An example here is developing new healthcare interventions from lab findings, which is shown as I. This type of research takes insights from basic science and applies them to real-world problems, especially in health and medicine. Then we have translational research, indicated as C. Its main goal is to bridge the gap between lab discoveries and practical applications, which is demonstrated by creating new teaching methods to improve literacy rates, shown as III. Basically, it's about translating scientific discoveries into tangible benefits for society. And finally, generalizing findings for broad understanding, labeled as IV, is a key aspect of basic research, as it helps us develop theories and models that can apply across different contexts. So, in essence, each research type has a distinct primary purpose, but they all work together to advance knowledge and improve our world. Recognizing these differences helps us better appreciate how research efforts are aimed and how they connect to the overall goal of scientific progress. Let's talk about qualitative research. This type of research is all about exploring and understanding the depth and meaning behind human experiences. It's not just about numbers, it's about capturing the nuances that reveal why people feel and act the way they do. When we say it's an unstructured, exploratory approach, we mean that it's flexible, open-ended, and designed to uncover underlying reasons, opinions, and motivations. We're not trying to fit data into predefined categories, but rather to understand the story behind the data. The primary goal here is to provide rich, nuanced insights into a phenomenon. It helps us grasp the complexity and quality of experiences, asking questions like why or how, those deeper questions that reveal underlying processes. And in terms of data type, we're dealing with non-numerical information, words, images, narratives, or observations. These help us see the world from the participants' perspectives, giving us a fuller picture of their experiences. So, in the context of our overall presentation, qualitative research is vital for understanding the human side of data, what people really think and feel, beyond what numbers can tell us. Now, let's look at some of the flexible and interactive data collection methods we can use. These include in-depth, open-ended interviews, which allow us to gather detailed insights directly from participants. Focus groups are another valuable tool, enabling us to explore different perspectives and stimulate discussion around key topics. Ethnographic observation involves immersing ourselves in the environment to see firsthand how people behave and interact. Additionally, analyzing documents or texts can reveal important contextual information and underlying meanings. When it comes to analysis, we often employ methods like thematic analysis, which helps us identify and interpret recurring patterns or themes across the data. Content analysis is useful for quantifying certain elements or concepts, while discourse analysis digs deeper into how language shapes meaning, looking for patterns, themes, and underlying messages in the words. Most importantly, our reasoning tends to be primarily inductive. That means we start with the data or observations and let those inform the development of our theories or understanding. Instead of imposing preconceived ideas, we let the evidence guide us toward meaningful insights, which aligns well with the overall goal of understanding complex social phenomena. Now, let's dive into what we mean by quantitative research. Essentially, it's all about quantifying the problem, transforming data into numbers that we can analyze statistically. This approach helps us measure and understand various aspects of a research problem in a very concrete way. A key point here is that it's a structured method. We use it to test theories, establish facts, and even look for correlations between variables. What's powerful about this is that it allows us to generalize our findings from a sample to a larger population, making our conclusions more widely applicable. The primary goal of quantitative research is to measure variables and test hypotheses. It's about identifying patterns and understanding the incidence of different views or behaviors within a target group. When we ask questions like how many, or how much, or even what is the relationship between X and Y, that's where quantitative research really shines. It provides us with the numerical data needed to answer these kinds of questions. So, in the context of our overall presentation theme, this approach helps us gather the hard data we need to make informed, evidence-based decisions. Now, let's take a look at data types, specifically numerical data. This includes things like scores, percentages, counts, or measurements. These are all quantitative measures that give us concrete numbers to analyze. When it comes to collecting this kind of data, we usually rely on highly structured and standardized methods. For example, surveys with closed-ended questions, such as Likert scales, allow us to gather consistent responses across participants. We also use experiments, especially randomized controlled trials, to test hypotheses under controlled conditions. And of course, we often collect existing statistical data, which can come from previous research or official records. Once we have the data, the analysis typically involves statistical methods. This includes both descriptive statistics, which summarize the data, and inferential statistics, which help us make predictions or test hypotheses about a larger population. Speaking of reasoning, in this context, we primarily use deductive reasoning. That means we start with a theory or hypothesis and then test it against our data. We're essentially confirming or refuting our initial assumptions based on the evidence we gather. So, to tie it all together, numerical data provides precise, measurable information. Using structured collection methods and statistical analysis, along with deductive reasoning, allows us to draw meaningful conclusions that support or challenge our initial ideas. Let's talk about mixed methods research. This approach intentionally combines both qualitative and quantitative methods within a single study. Essentially, it means collecting and analyzing different types of data, numbers and words, to get a fuller picture. When we say qualitative data, we're referring to insights like opinions, experiences, or observations, while quantitative data involves numerical information and statistics. The key here is integrating these findings to draw more comprehensive conclusions. The main goal is to leverage the strengths of both methods. By doing so, we can understand complex research problems more deeply than we could with just one approach alone. This process is often called triangulation because it cross-verifies results from different methods, increasing our confidence in the findings. Overall, mixed methods research is about creating a richer, more nuanced understanding by thoughtfully combining diverse data sources. So, one key feature of mixed methods research is the integration, or what we often call the mixing of two types of data at some point in the research process. This could happen during data collection, analysis, or even interpretation. The idea is to combine the strengths of both quantitative and qualitative data to gain a more comprehensive understanding of the research problem. Let's look at some design examples to clarify this. In an explanatory sequential design, for instance, you start by collecting quantitative data, say, measuring stress levels across a group. Then, you follow up with qualitative methods, like interviews, focusing on those with high stress scores to understand why their stress is particularly high. This way, the qualitative data helps explain the initial quantitative findings. On the other hand, in an exploratory sequential design, you begin with qualitative data collection to explore a topic that's not well understood. From those insights, you develop a survey or another quantitative instrument to test hypotheses or measure the themes you identified. The key takeaway here is that the timing and purpose of combining the data types can vary, but the goal is always to enrich your understanding through this integration. So, whether you're using an explanatory or exploratory approach, mixing data types thoughtfully enhances the depth and breadth of your research insights, aligning perfectly with the overall theme of using diverse methods to tackle complex research questions. Now, let's look at some key differences in research approaches, starting with sample size. Small, non-random samples are typical in in-depth, qualitative research. They allow us to explore complex meanings and experiences deeply. On the other hand, large, random samples are common in quantitative research, aiming for generalizability across populations. And sometimes, the sample size varies depending on the research design itself, especially in mixed-method studies. Moving on to the summarized differences, we can see that the features distinguish these approaches clearly. Qualitative research primarily focuses on words, meanings, and lived experiences. It's about understanding the depth of human perspectives. Quantitative research, however, emphasizes numbers, statistics, and measurements. It's about testing hypotheses and measuring variables. Mixed methods combine both, offering a comprehensive picture by integrating qualitative and quantitative data. As for the research goals, qualitative aims to explore, understand, and interpret phenomena, digging into the why and how. Quantitative seeks to test theories, measure variables, and generalize findings to larger populations. Mixed methods strive for a more complete understanding, often using triangulation to validate results through multiple perspectives. Connecting this to the overall theme, these differences highlight how choosing a research approach depends on your specific questions and objectives. Whether you're seeking rich, detailed insights or broad, generalizable data, understanding these distinctions helps you select the best method for your study. Let's take a closer look at the summarized differences between these research types. On this slide, we see a table that highlights the key distinctions. Starting with question types, qualitative research often explores why, how, and what things mean. It focuses on understanding underlying motivations and interpretations. Quantitative research, on the other hand, asks how many, what proportion, and if there's a link, so it's more about measuring and quantifying phenomena. Then, mixed methods research combines both approaches, aiming to understand how prevalent a problem is and why people experience it in particular ways. Moving to analysis, qualitative methods use thematic, content, or discourse analysis, methods that interpret patterns and meanings in data. Quantitative analysis relies on statistical tests, regression, and descriptive stats to analyze numerical data. And finally, the mixed methods approach integrates and synthesizes findings from both qualitative and quantitative data, providing a comprehensive understanding. This table really highlights how each approach serves different research questions and goals, but also how they can complement each other when combined. It's important to remember that choosing the right method depends on what you want to find out. Keep these differences in mind as we move toward designing our own studies. Now, let's look at some key characteristics of qualitative research. When we ask which of these options is typical for qualitative methods, the correct answer is C, seeks in-depth understanding of experiences and meanings. Unlike quantitative research, which often relies on numerical data and statistical analysis, qualitative methods focus on exploring the richness of human experiences, perceptions, and social contexts. This approach helps us understand the why and how behind behaviors and attitudes. Moving on to our second question, which data collection method is primarily quantitative? The best answer here is C, structured questionnaires with Likert scales. These are designed to gather numerical data that can be analyzed statistically, making them a staple in quantitative research. In contrast, methods like focus groups, ethnography, and participant observation tend to be more qualitative, emphasizing detailed, contextual insights rather than numerical data. Connecting this to our overall theme, understanding the differences between qualitative and quantitative research helps us choose the right approach depending on our research goals, whether we want depth and meaning or breadth and generalizability. All right, let's wrap up what we've covered today. We've learned about the definition and key characteristics of both primary and secondary research, and how they differ from each other. Remember, primary research involves collecting new data firsthand, while secondary research uses existing information. We also explored the different types of research, basic, applied, and translational, and how each serves a unique purpose in advancing knowledge and solving real-world problems. Furthermore, we looked at the different research methods, qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods, and understood their differences and when to use each. Recognizing these distinctions helps us choose the right approach depending on our research goals. Overall, this knowledge equips you to approach research more strategically, understanding which methods and types fit best with your objectives. This comprehensive understanding is essential as we continue to develop our skills in conducting meaningful and impactful research.